fully functioning time-space GPS. I just want peace.
What's going on, everyone? It's Sam. Welcome back to the channel. Today I have a really interesting topic. We're talking about how Kang could be a descendant of Tony Stark in the MCU. Now, for all you comic fans, this would definitely be something different, but that's what the MCU tends to do. So let's discuss all the information on this theory. If you like Marvel, the MCU, comics, and everything in between, subscribe to the channel. But other than that, let's get into the video. Let's go. In the comics, and similar to how He Who Remains explained it in Loki, Nathaniel Richards, or Kang, is a descendant of Reed Richards far into the future where he was born in the 31st century. Eventually, Nathaniel does get his time travel ideas from Doctor Doom and his technology, and is able to master it to become a time traveler, eventually known as Kang, and then of course all of his other variants across time. But what if I were to tell you that in the MCU, not only would he have gotten his time travel ideas from Tony Stark, but that he was also a descendant as him as well? So let's take a look. As we saw in the Loki finale, time is depicted as an ongoing loop around He Who Remains. This singular time stream, or timeline as it's referred to as the sacred timeline, is not only the timeline he protected, but also the MCU's main timeline that we see on screen. When I explain this, you have to picture time as something that we don't usually picture it as. In regular day-to-day life, it's a continuous road always pushing forward. Time is always ticking, the clock is always moving. In the MCU, there are points in time, but now picture time as every second, past, present, and future, all together. Because as He Who Remains mentions in the finale, everything has to happen as intended. The timeline is currently in a preconceived loop, all so that the same thing keeps on happening, which is He Who Remains on top of everything. But how is this achieved? Because Tony Stark is the inventor of time travel in the MCU, and for the loop to continue, Kang needs Stark to create time travel. Think about it, as we know right now, no time travel was ever created or possible until Tony Stark creates it in the year 2023. This is the catalyst for all and any time travel within the timeline. When Kang perfects it in the 31st century, the actual invention of time travel still dates back to Stark in 2023. The fully functioning time-space GPS that Tony creates looks like a very similar or first version of Kang's TemPad. And the idea that you could locate and coordinate times and space, you can even see that one of the set locations is just near the 31st century when the Avengers are testing it out. It's unknown if Tony traveled there, but it also could be how he knew time travel would mess back.
That's my man. You lose this again, I'm keeping it.
What happened?
If you mess with time, it tends to mess back. You'll see.
This clip is meant as an idea of Thanos returning, but just like many things that they have done, they like to retcon history by explaining or filling in gaps in future projects. Similar to how we keep getting more information to anything regarding Cap during the time he was frozen, we're looking at you, Isaiah Bradley, and Red Guardian. And to prove how Stark knew about Kang or vice versa, we have to look into the Wakanda files, which is an MCU canon published book including tons of Shuri notes and MCU information. Now within this book, Tony is shown explaining to Bruce Banner about the Deutsch proposition. The proposition is a reference or explainer about parallel universes, something that He Who Remains, which I'm just going to say is Kang now since they're all the same person, or variants essentially. But Kang explains to Loki and Sylvie that he found out parallel universes existed in the 31st century. In Tony's letter to Bruce, he explains that altering the events of the past could never affect the continuous loops, though it could create split timelines, and that they should only worry about this universe first and to keep it simple. But why is this important? Because the Deutsch proposition and what it theorized is actually what Kang the Conqueror, or Nathaniel Richards, was able to find out, that universes are parallel to each other and that they stack on top of each other. Tony is at this point aware of the idea of the multiverse and references that what they are currently in, as Loki did confirm, is the sacred timeline. This continuous loop of time is meant to happen, and as Renslayer said, what the Avengers were supposed to do was supposed to happen. And by the way, the idea of free will is still a thing because it's how branches are birthed. The idea that you still have the ability to make decisions can create nexus events on that branch. But eventually, everything will happen as it's intended to go. And I do have a video talking about free will in the MCU, however it is going to take a long time, there's a lot of philosophical background behind it. But like I was saying, the events of Infinity War and Endgame needed to happen so that Stark can create the idea of time travel and journey into their time heist. You could also look at Strange's 1 in 14 million chances of winning. The one outlier win is essentially the timeline where Nathaniel Richards eventually becomes Kang, in part due to Tony's invention of time travel. Because basically, or eventually, what would happen is it would always lead to this perfection of that said time travel. The multiversal war, the sacred timeline, and Kang as he who remains on top. And the loop is for his greater good. It's reincarnation, baby. Sylvie killing him just resets that idea of the timeline, and that's what we are about to see. The fallout of the rise of Kang, future events, and Nathaniel Richards doing everything that he does in the 31st century, which results in a place where he once again would create the sacred timeline after the war. Like he says, the TVA was created to stop himself from himself. But by killing him, it just resets the loop and the multiverse, eventually leading to a council of Kangs in war. Now, one thing interesting that Kang says is that he wants to be killed. But if that he wasn't killed, Loki and Sylvie could take over. He says that it's a game for the young, the hungry, which in theory would literally just be a younger version of himself, someone that's not he who remains, most likely Prime Kang that we're going to see in Ant-Man Quantumania. Because although this looks and technically is one timeline, the sacred timeline is a collection of the universes put together and then set up and restricted as one main timeline. As Miss Minutes also explained in the beginning, that's why the timeline is linked together by strands. The idea of all these timelines converged into one. The timekeepers were just a story placeholder for Kang in Miss Minutes' explanation, but that's what he accomplished. As he said, he was able to isolate this timeline together. And all this really did is end the multiversal war, but the idea of the multiverse is still out there. There was always other types of universes. So by killing him and resetting the loop, it opens up back to the rest of the main multiverse, which still existed before Loki. So that's why killing him unleashes the full potential of the multiverse, and this idea that all of his bad variants are now not contained and would cause the multiversal war again in the future. That's why when we see Kang's statue at the end of the finale, it's not necessarily a new universe that Loki is in. It's actually the same TVA, but because the loop is still going as is, the events are just restarted with Bat or the main Prime Kang in power. The end goal is for he who remains to end up back in his chair on top. But it's for the young, it's for the hungry, it's for the multiversal war to happen once again. For his young version to step up, stop the multiversal war again, and become he who remains.
I'm in a loop. I'm caught in a time loop. This is exactly where it all went wrong.
I know.
Kang and Tony are more alike than we think, but picture Tony on a smaller scale. He was the biggest enemy of himself, which led to him creating Ultron, the same way Kang is most scared of his other variant selves. In the original draft of the final episode, there was actually supposed to be more time for Loki and Sylvie to wander around the Citadel, where they would uncover tons of Easter eggs and artifacts that were the most important to Kang's adventures, one of which is the Iron Man helmet. This would not only be an easy way, but a great way to connect Iron Lad to Iron Man in the MCU, and it would explain the similar looking suit as well to his admiration for Iron Man, because Iron Man creates the science that he needs to perfect in the future. Now in the comics, Iron Man and Iron Lad aren't connected. However, if Kang is truly a descendant of Tony Stark or looked up to him for all of what he invented back in the day, this would make sense that his prototype armor for Iron Lad resembles Iron Man. Iron Lad is just another variant of Kang the Conqueror and an important member to the Young Avengers. In an alternate timeline, 16-year-old Nathaniel Richards was being bullied, and one day Kang the Conqueror, Nathaniel's future self, saves him from dying. Kang then gave this younger self a neurokinetic armor and showed Nathaniel glimpses of his future where he would be destined to become the time-traveling conqueror known as Kang. Now by showing him this, Kang had hoped that his young self would begin on his destined path earlier than planned. However, the young Nathaniel attacks his future self. Nathaniel decides to renounce his destiny and uses time-traveling capabilities and his armor to travel back in time and across dimensions to the modern age of Earth 616. He would then become Iron Lad, and to prevent himself, he creates the Young Avengers team, because he didn't want to become Kang. Eventually what happens is he realizes that he's always destined to become who he is, which is Kang. But the idea of the Iron Lad origin stems from future Kang giving him armor in the look of Iron Man. So not only has Tony given him time travel capabilities, but at this point he would also be the basis for what Kang's Iron Lad suit would be made of. And let's face it, Tony Stark is the face of the MCU. As much as people hate that he's tied to everything, this just further confirms that. This deep connection is much easier and a practical way of making Kang a descendant of Tony, or at least the creator of influence for all of his perfected inventions. Because let's face it, Reed Richards is still not in the MCU, And if everything was built off Tony and he was the one to invent time travel, this seems like it would be the perfect reason for why Kang is able to do what he can do. And this would be why the Iron Man helmet is still in his citadel, because he owes a thanks to Tony Stark for creating time travel and helping him become who he is. But that's all for this video. I have a ton of content coming out, literally covering everything, so make sure you're subscribed and let me know what you want to see next. Drop a like if you enjoyed and follow me on Twitter at AnotherMarvelG for all updates. Other than that, I just want to say thank you. I'm Another Marvel Guy, and I'll see you soon.